COVID and beyond. To briefly set the context, entrepreneurs have always been an engine for growth and innovation. You know this, you are these entrepreneurs. When you saw the video, I hope that the words of courage, fearlessness, grassroots, really anchoring in your deep understanding of consumers, of markets, of the needs and dynamics of the continent resonated with you. They should. You are the ones who are coming through with innovative ideas that are not just about bringing new technologies or products to market, but it's also about a vision that you establish for the future. It's a vision for how we want to realize Africa today and over the next few years, decades, and generations to come. And in particular, your systems architects. What does this mean? This recognizes that you're not operating in a vacuum, that you're operating in a mix of complexities that require support and engagement from policymakers, from investors, from philanthropists, from your consumers, and from yourselves on a day-to-day basis. And it's your ability to navigate those challenges that makes your positioning distinct. This is the context and the characteristics you hold in any conversation, in any time of year, but the impact of COVID in particular is exacerbating these complexities. That's it. Thank you. We recognize that COVID is shocking economies across the continent and around the world. It began with the health shock, but very quickly tackled some of the challenges around the economy. And what we recognize is that COVID-19 has compounded issues that we were already beginning to see. The way in which it has compounded the complexities of already strained or insufficiently resourced health systems has made challenges more difficult. The recognition that the complications this brings to aspects of food security, understanding the opportunities for growth of agriculture, which is now constrained by limited imports, exports, closing of borders, movement of people, again exacerbates the challenge. And recognizing that there are a number of other factors going on in the background, the locust infestation in East Africa, the impact on oil prices in Nigeria and other areas in West Africa. Addressing each of these challenges means that the characteristics you bring to the conversation, the experience that you're facing, is even more complex in today's context. What does a day-to-day feel like? What we've heard from you and what we continue to experience as entrepreneurs, I know I've had these conversations with the panelists we'll speak to in a few minutes, is that there are immediate impacts on your own businesses. Complexities with supply chains that are being inhibited due to border closings and the ability to access critical inputs. The complexities of operations and the uncertainty of consumer demand in many places coming to an entire halt in the very near term, but posing the question, how quickly will these things begin to open up and restrain? You're facing a range of challenges in your daily operations. What makes this complex, and if we move to the final slide, is the question you must be facing. Beyond the day-to-day actions that you're taking, navigating COVID-19 requires a broader understanding and broader inquiry into the question of what's actually happening within your sector, your industry, the way in which the economy or the systems you work in are evolving over time. What we've observed is that there are potentially 4 different scenarios that can be playing out depending where you sit and depending how you're experiencing the shocks. The first is new winners. There is a possibility that within the shock of COVID, the shock is actually a powerful one and one that accelerates your business, that accelerates the opportunities, opens up new spaces, opens up new ways in which you can engage consumers, in which the demands that you knew or thought or saw was there is beginning to come to the forefront more quickly. The second is a recognition that in other cases, it will be maybe a time for hibernation. It may be that in the short term, it simply won't be possible to continue with the path or the model that you once had. But how can you protect yourself for the near term until this time passes and things begin to open up again? The third is a recognition of perhaps it's going to be a lengthier recovery. The shock has hit, it's starting to subsume, we're seeing different decisions taken, but it's going to take a while to get back to the place where things once were, or it may evolve in a slightly different way. And so what does that mean in terms of resilience and dynamics of business models? And finally, the harsh reality of what may be a managed decline. The reality is that we may be in a situation where the business models of the past, the solutions on the table, simply won't be responsive and relevant to our communities, our markets, and the customers and consumers that we're trying to serve. And so what does that mean in terms of managing through those ups and downs and finding space in the resilience of entrepreneurs? I think we know many entrepreneurs are not just coming with one business idea, one model, but how can you be thoughtful, conscious, and maybe weaving out of one and into the next, recognizing your unique positioning to see what's really needed for the continent. I pose these questions simply to offer some initial insights, perhaps spark some thinking for our conversations between Maji and Brian coming up in just a moment, and then thereafter the panel of participants who are joining us from, again, across the continent, across industries, and have experienced these shocks and are looking for ways to respond both as entrepreneurs and as actors well more beyond in the ecosystem. So with that, I'll hand over to Maji Sok, as mentioned, co-founder of the Women's Investment Club in Senegal, as well as Layu, and Brian Wong, the Vice President of Global Initiatives for the Alibaba Group. Maji, over to you.
Excellent. Wonderful. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very, very much to Brian and the rest of the team from Alibaba Foundation. We're very excited to be engaging in this conversation. I will jump right in, as that will allow us to get as much as we can from Brian. We're very eager to hear from you in the 10 minutes we have. But first, why don't I let you introduce yourself, and then I have 3 questions for you, and we'll share a little bit of my experience as we discuss.
Thank you, Maji, and thank you to the ANPI team and to Dalberg and Robin for the great introduction. My name is Brian Wong. I'm Vice President at Alibaba. My present responsibilities really focus around management of the Alibaba Business School's global initiatives. And that really includes capacity building programs for entrepreneurs who are digital entrepreneurs building their local ecosystems in places like Africa and Asia. We also work with governments and conduct workshops to share our experience in the digital economy, as well as educational institutions. So very honored to be part of a very distinguished group of speakers today, and looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. And just as part of your introduction, you've already spoken to some of the groups you're working with, from government to directly with entrepreneurs, and I'm sure many other actors in between. What we're finding ourselves in, or what we're observing in Africa at the moment, entrepreneurship is very high on the agenda, on everyone's lips, and obviously with COVID, the conversation has even accelerated in terms of what are the new opportunities we should be capturing. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how to do it and position entrepreneurship as not just for the educated. As you know, in Africa, where some of our literacy rates are very low, it's not just for formal enterprise. We all know some of our countries have more than 95% of the economy is informal. It's not just about urban. It's not just about setting a company. It's also the job creation element that is a priority. Very much about digital, but also how do you touch on all the very many sectors where there's still a huge opportunity. When we start talking about this, terms come out as how do you fund all of this? Financing is core to the conversation. We start to struggle with definitions. What do you call an entrepreneur? What do you call an SME? What's a startup, and how do they benefit from some facilities or support from government? We're increasingly hearing about mass entrepreneurship. How do you promote entrepreneurship for people where they are, and how do they serve their communities, and how can they also touch other markets? So a lot of questions, a lot of work streams, and everything happening at the same time in Africa, to the point where we ask ourselves, do we need to step back? How do you prioritize? What do we focus on? And we hear about all these wonderful stories in China. So to no surprise, you want to hear, how did China do it? What did you do? How did you address all of this coming to you at once?
Great. Well, Maji, I think you laid out the context very clearly and what we're all facing in the world, but particularly in Africa today. I think that it's becoming quite urgent to face these issues. China as a country was not unlike Africa 20 years ago. And I think this is why our founder, Jack Ma, and now his foundation feel so passionate about Africa and the things that we're doing on that continent with partners such as Dalberg and many others. I think that Azara and Robin used the word heroes to describe entrepreneurs, because in our experience in China, it is the entrepreneurs who were the heroes in helping to transform the society. When Alibaba was created in 1999, the per capita income in China was $800 per person. Today, it's 10,000 US dollars per person. In 1999, e-commerce made up virtually, not even 1% of the world's e-commerce volume. Today, it's over 43%. I think that Africa is about 1.2 billion people. China is about 1.4 billion people. And so, and Africa has one of the youngest, or the youngest population on Earth. 60% of the people or the population is under the age of 25. China at the time had a younger population, and entrepreneurship was something that was still very nascent. So I think that what Jack saw when he came to Africa in 2017 for the first time was a country, as a continent in the countries that he visited, that had so much potential because of the youth, because of the spirit of the youth, but also because of the fact that there wasn't a lot of traditional, or how should I say, developed traditional economic systems in place. What many people think of as a disadvantage: you don't have a developed banking system, you don't have a developed retail sector. Some might think that's a disadvantage. China was not different in 1999 in that way. But what Jack recognized is that there is this opportunity for the youth to play a role as entrepreneurs, to become the heroes in their communities and help build that. And so when you talk about mass entrepreneurship, and I know, Maji, you're one of the thought leaders in this topic, mass entrepreneurship being millions of small businesses employing just anywhere from 5 to 20 people, but creating massive jobs and economic value for society. Alibaba in its marketplace today has over 10 million merchants on the platform. 97% of them employ less than 5 people. 95% of them invest less than $4,500 to set up the business. And 90% of these businesses on Taobao have owners who have no more than a high school education. In aggregate, they've created about 40 million jobs for the country. And so I think what we would like to share is the Alibaba experience, and highlight some of the ways that digital technology has transformed the Chinese society that started out at a very poor economic level, and has really in the last 20 years transformed itself in a large part because of the digital economy. And although we do not believe in a cookie cutter approach that say, just because we did it this way in China, in Africa they should do it this way. What we believe is that we have lessons to share, both the success and the failures. And we hope that at a minimum, this will give the entrepreneurs the confidence to become an entrepreneur, to try these things, to take the chances, and create something that fits the Africa needs, the Africa model. And I think that's what Jack wants to do in his creation of the Jack Ma African Entrepreneur Prize initiative. That's what he wants in the creation of the Alibaba Business School, and sharing with the eFounder Fellows, that another program that we run. And the hope that it's the entrepreneurs in partnership with the public sector can create. I'm back.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I think we froze all there for a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that hopefully answers your question, that Jack's aspirations in creating these programs and his foundation initiatives are really meant to share the lessons, but also inspire the youth to create their own solutions for their communities.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I think it's very encouraging and gives a lot of hope in terms of what's possible to transform our economies. Perhaps one question that I know many African entrepreneurs ask themselves and receive feedback when they share what they're doing. We tend to be very proud of being serial entrepreneurs in many countries in Africa, and that could mean one business after the other, but oftentimes it means multiple businesses at the same time. It comes from many aspects. One is once you start working in a value chain or in a sector, you start realizing the many other needs that exist. So, you can start doing something in for example, the textile sector, let's say, and next thing you know, you have to deliver, you have to engage in the supply chain, and it gives ideas on other businesses to start first to serve that initial business idea, and if you do it well, others ask for that service. So what you'll end up having is many entrepreneurs in Africa who are doing many things. And oftentimes when they share that their journey, what is said is you need to focus. In a lot of markets that have more mature economies, that's the name of the game. You need to focus, do it well before you start to do something else. I'm a first victim of that. Every year there's a new idea, 10 others that are waiting in some sort of a drawer, but I'll keep them there for now. What is your advice to African entrepreneurs in terms of this idea of focusing, or just go all out and do what you need to do and see what sticks? Sometimes that's also what's driving it. And how does Alibaba think of the entrepreneurship in that context?
Yeah, good question, Maji. I think that from our point of view, the most important thing for entrepreneurs first is identifying the problem they want to solve. And hopefully that's a social problem that has meaning and impact on the community around them. And I think that's really how Alibaba started with this mission to make it easy to do business anywhere, which really meant that we wanted to focus on helping the small guys, the small businesses, become part of the formal economy or the mainstream economy with the help of technology. So my advice to entrepreneurs would be that it's critical that before you do anything, is you ask yourself why it is that you're creating this company. What problem are you trying to solve? And then how are you going to solve that? Now, it's possible that you might have other ideas that pop up, but the easiest thing to do in terms of filtering whether or not you pursue that idea is ask yourself, does it fit with the mission that I've set for the company or the venture that I established? If it's something completely unrelated, then you need to ask yourself, is this really worth my time? Do I have a greater mission? Do I have a different mission that I'd rather follow, and I'm willing to give up what I'm doing now? Because what Jack often says is you need to ask yourself 3 questions. What is it? What do you have? What do you want? And what are you willing to give up? And only by asking those 3 questions can you then be an effective entrepreneur that's able to get results, but also make impact.
Thank you. We'll need a whole other webinar on what are you willing to give up? Always a very, very difficult question, but very, very real in some of the cultural context where we are. But that's for another time. And perhaps one last question here is, and Zahra spoke to it at the beginning around the additional areas you're starting to look at, the global programs you've mentioned earlier. We've been very appreciative in terms of some of the donations made when COVID started, and we can see some of the new areas you're exploring. And we're all curious, what next? How are you thinking about Alibaba, the foundation, even in the context, in the press, we're seeing a lot the Alibaba being the face of China in terms of engaging with some countries. How do you see that? What's next? And make us dream here, where, you know, we also want to build these national champions that one day are able to look beyond and say, you know, so here's what I can do to support other countries, communities.
Yes.
Make us dream. We want to get there too. We want more champions that can do that.
Okay, so I think that, look, the Jack Ma Foundation is really focusing its efforts on trying to inspire the youth by giving them role models through this African Entrepreneur Prize initiative. What we then do in working closely with the foundation is provide the training and the capacity building for the entrepreneurs, both who participate in the prize, but also the larger e-Founder Fellowship, to create a community of trust, Maji, because I think that if you have the skills and the know-how, the technical capabilities, that is a very, very important piece. But in addition to that, in order to create collaborations that work, in order to create scale for an impact for your venture, you need to work with others, because the new normal, so to speak, not only vis-a-vis COVID-19, the new normal of the digital economy is about collaboration. Because through technology and through network effects, we actually grow the pie as opposed to fight over just a limited pie. You actually create abundance in the face of perceived scarcity, but it's for the very fact that you have collaboration and network effects that you are able to create more prosperity for everyone. And this is why Alibaba is so passionate about working with Africa, is because we believe here's a continent with so many young people that actually represents the future. These young people, if we empower them through technology, through skills, through engagement of the mainstream economy, which will now become the digital economy, they can not only provide a living for themselves and help their community, but eventually leapfrog and hopefully lead a lot of the changes that are taking place in the world through the use of technology. And so in your opening remarks, you talked about the challenges that Africa might be facing in terms of, you know, the lack of infrastructure, in terms of the literacy rates. But one thing I can tell you from our China experience is that things like that of the traditional sort of mindset, the traditional development theories that said you need a certain level of high literacy rate before you can access technology. We've actually found that limitation now is being reduced because of technology. The accessibility to technology today, the threshold is being lowered because of the innovation that's happening. At the same time, you see that the difference between those in the city and those in the rural areas at the same level of education, it's not the education that makes the biggest difference in terms of their earning power. It's whether or not they embrace technology. And this has been very clear in the statistics that we've seen in our research in China. And so we believe the same can apply to Africa and other emerging markets. So I think the hope is that Africa and its youth will embrace technology. They'll build a new future for themselves that fits the needs that they have in their own countries and their communities. They'll come up with innovative solutions, and they will create a community of prosperity and abundance because of technology and set the standards for the rest of the world on how to do this. And that would be the ideal outcome of all the efforts that we do together.
Brian, I was going to ask you for some concluding remarks, but I think you just did that in a beautiful way, and with some you know, ideas and suggestions that really stick. I'm leaving with the word collaboration really sticking, and that resonates in terms of many and most African cultures and just way of being. How do we collaborate, work together, and that sense of community is also very powerful. The data on technology and access to digital platforms, it speaks for itself. So that's very well noted, and how it can serve, does serve, and will continue to serve as a springboard. So thank you very much. You leave us with a lot of hope, and we'll continue to try and do it all. And learn that it is possible. Thank you very much. I will pass it on, I believe, to Robin. Thanks, Brian. Robin, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Maji. And I'm not going to delay the process any further. So I will try to hand over to James Mwangi, the Executive Director of the Dalberg Group, who is going to introduce our panelists that have kindly joined us and immediately kick off a conversation. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Maji and Brian, for a very inspiring kickoff to this conversation. Brian, you've really put us on the spot in terms of what might be possible if we can parallel the kind of journey that that Alibaba has been on. Thankfully, for the next part of this conversation, I have 4 voices that I think are more than up to the challenge of picking up on that dialogue. They are each entrepreneurs, but in that very African fashion that Maji talked about, each of them has had a very broad and varied experience. And so as we speak to Ada Osakwe, Myriam Said, Dare Okoudjou, and Okolloh, hopefully we'll be able to build a picture of what does it mean to be an entrepreneur in Africa in this time of COVID. What types of opportunities does it open up, but also what are the very real challenges and realities that we're facing. And I'll start with you, Ada. You know, you are a redoubtable entrepreneur. You've built Nuli into, you know, from nothing into a network of stores, providing a really different experience for the Nigerian consumer around food, building on your experience in the agricultural sector, and indeed, even before that, working in government in the Ministry of Agriculture. Having been on that journey, and having built out through sweat and toil this business, how is the current crisis affecting and impacting your business? And how do you think about resilience at a time when the Nigerian economy, as we all know, is being very hard hit and clearly has implications for what has become your life's work?
Wow, thank you for this very pertinent conversation we're having. And I really do hope that we have a lot more as the weeks unfold. James, you did mention that from my end, I've been an entrepreneur for 5 years, and I was so excited to just build, and do things that for many years I had advised other people to do. So we have a situation where my company that I'm operating, the Newly Juice Company, we're basically a farm-to-table restaurant chain and a juice brand, and we buy only locally grown agriculture produce. So I kind of think about what Robin shared earlier on with how these interrelated shocks are going on for entrepreneurs right now with COVID. And it's brilliant because as you think about operations, supply chain, and the consumer downstream end. And for us, operations has just been flipped on its head. It's global, I know, but sometimes it's just, you think about it and you're still pretty much shocked. We were really on a growth trajectory. Last year, we opened 10 stores. We were smashing our records in the first quarter. We had about 60 people on our payroll. They're still on the payroll, praying about it. 60 people on our payroll were buying from farmers. We did about 300 tons of fruits and vegetables from farmers. About 80 farming families were impacting. So I was really excited. But then it's all come to a halt. And we really are in that hibernation phase you're kind of talking about. On the supply chain side, prices have skyrocketed because of the breaks there and increases of transportation and all. But the consumer side, one would say, okay, you're doing food, you should be fine. You're an essential service, people have to eat. And in addition, you're doing healthy food, so people are thinking about their immunity and stuff like that. But unfortunately, people are still really scared. So they're not buying in the way they typically would. And secondly, we had a whole strategy around brick and mortar, small formats, being in high density areas, foot traffic, and suddenly that's all gone. So our sales in April was down about over 80%. So we did about nearly 20% of our typical monthly earnings. And as I think about how this is translating into things, we are a small and growing business. And I'm based in Nigeria. I'm sorry, I don't think I said that earlier on. We're a small and growing business. And this shock has happened. And I just can't understand how, from a standpoint of policy, which I've worked in before, we're not synchronizing our healthcare response, which is first and foremost the problem we have to deal with the economic response. So we have a situation where a country like Nigeria has still done nothing for small and growing businesses. You guys talked about the hibernation phase and maybe getting palliatives and cheap loans, whatever, to keep us going and to keep a workforce going. But unfortunately, this hasn't happened. You have countries like Ghana next door who give about $200 million to their small and medium enterprises. You have countries like, I believe, Mexico, that about $1 billion has gone to their small and medium enterprises. And I can go on and on. But over here, nothing has happened. So for the last 5 weeks, we've been pretty much left on our own. We, as being the entrepreneurs, the audacious folks that we are, and the heroes, you guys, the resilience you talk about, we're just trying to get by. And what's going on now is that we're coming together as a group, rallying around the same problem, the same pain points we're pretty much feeling, to see how we can be a bigger voice to advocate for change. We really believe that this is a time to start on a new, clean slate. But unfortunately, it's going to be a really big uphill battle. So it's an interesting one, and we're still trying to figure it all out. But as you think about the fact that small businesses account for over 40% of the GDP in Africa, over 80% of, I think, the workforce as well, I can understand how we're not synchronizing those responses in a very deliberate way.
That is a very interesting pivot point, Myriam, to you. In a sense, your journey has been the mirror image of others, starting as a founding partner at Kifia and building up that fintech business in Ethiopia, and now serving in the office of the Prime Minister as an advisor on digital transformation. At a time when digital transformation suddenly moves to the very center of the resilience agenda. What should and what are governments doing or trying to do in the African context with all of our constraints? What could or should they be doing to help entrepreneurs like Ada, like yourself in your previous guise, respond to this moment of crisis? And how might the entrepreneurs themselves best adapt to and make the most of this shifting paradigm?
Thank you, James, and thank you for having me. Thank you very much to Dalberg, to Alibaba, to the Jack Ma Foundation, with whom we've had very close collaborations. They've been very helpful in assisting Ethiopia and the continent as a whole, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them again for all the support they have provided us. Indeed, I started the other way around. I was one of the founders of a digital financial service provider in Ethiopia in 2012, where no laws existed for digital. So we had to be extremely creative and innovative in how we designed our business and in the operations of our business. So what we tried to do is launch digital payments in a context where there was no law for digital payments. So we tried to do the best that we could in terms of digitizing back-end offices and easing payments by enabling people to go to one center rather than them going to different centers to pay for bills or for any government to citizen services. So when I transitioned to government, it was with a clear understanding that what I wanted to do was to highlight the importance for Ethiopia to embrace digital transformation at all levels and in all sectors. And we are a developing nations that cannot afford to ignore the importance of the fourth industrial revolution. And in this time of COVID, more than ever today, we have an increased urgency to develop Ethiopia's digital foundations through increasing expansions and resilience of internet networks. As you might know, Ethiopia is still a monopoly. We are in the process of liberalizing and partially privatizing our telecom. So the resilience of our internet networks, making more bandwidth available to government and students, helping promote online working and learning. We do not have a full lockdown yet in the country. We just have a partial lockdown where governments actually work at 20 to 25% of their effective in their offices. So what government did immediately was to look into innovations. The Prime Minister called for an innovation challenge, and a platform was created where entrepreneurs can actually log any opportunities they may have and they may want to develop. We created a national technical committee to look into how we could capture data better, and we've had an incredible amount of responses. I think in the span of 3 days, we had 1,600 people responding to opportunities, to challenges, which they turned into opportunities. What the government is doing right now is looking into how we could, first of all, ease doing business, obviously how we can enable those entrepreneurs to further elaborate on their innovations. We're looking at digital funding to digital startups and small suppliers that are most subject to the macroeconomic shocks and have little capacity to sustain their cash flows. We've given tax breaks and we requested all tenants to reduce rents. We actually provide 1 year tax-free or employment tax-free for all the entrepreneurs that have retained their employees. And in terms of innovation, like I said earlier, it is looking at how we can de-risk their businesses, provide them access to markets. We've seen, any innovations from hand washing basins based on motion sensing, masks, ventilators, AI-based tracing systems, chatbots. So it was quite overwhelming. In addition, what we are doing, and like I said, Ethiopia is at its infancy in terms of digital. So we're trying to look at how we can enable digital payments. If we ever do have a lockdown, how would we build this infrastructure in terms of having or giving the capacity to people to pay for electricity, to get food, to get medical, to get medicines. So we created this group that is looking at how we can immediately enable e-commerce platforms, delivery services. It has accelerated actually the endorsement of our electronic transaction proclamation. It's currently at Parliament and it's about to be endorsed. So e-receipts would be recognized. Digital payments or electronic money issuer directives have been issued, and the National Bank or our central bank is about to issue a payment operator directive to enable these people. So this is how we've tried to support. We're, as you may know, we're still at the beginning of this crisis. We hope not, but we've had our first peak today. So we don't really know how it's going to evolve, and we're just trying to be as ready as possible.
And it sounds like there's a little bit of a link back to your entrepreneurial roots. There's a range of interventions. You're seeing which ones work, and even within a limited context, trying to pull some levers to respond. Dare, you have been on a long entrepreneurial journey, building MFS over the years, and as a technology and payment solution company with a distinctly African set of innovations and solutions to a distinct African problem, which is we're all divided up in these countries and we all work all over the place, far from where we are. How do we send money around? How do we transact with each other? you've seen your fair share over the years of hard times, and you had to go through some resilience. It would be useful to hear from you about moments of some particular moments of resilience that might inspire those of us who are on the call as we face this kind of unprecedented crisis right now of COVID-19 for African entrepreneurs. So, what gives you confidence in that in that ability to push through this current challenge? Dari?
Hi, sorry, I was still on mute. Thanks very much, James. I think the first piece of good news is what Myriam just said. I mean, Ethiopia has been on our radar for a very long time, and anyone in this business know that it's not an easy market from a payment and digital payment point of view. So I'm really pleased to hear what Myriam is saying in terms of the acceleration we are seeing in that respect in the crisis. In general, I would say, first of all, one of the things we learned, and I learned, is that the environment could be the same, but the realities can be singular. And we in particular, as MFS Africa, in this crisis, I'm sure you all have seen some articles in The Economist recently talking about the crisis for remittance. There was a research by the World Bank predicting about 20% fall in remittance globally. This is probably going to be true, but how is being experienced by a company like ours and in Africa, where digital top form of payment is really becoming the de facto standard, is very different. We are still seeing massive growth, and if anything, in the crisis, our growth rate has accelerated over the last 2-3 months. So that means that kind of reinforce a little bit my belief that the realities can be singular. What do we have as African entrepreneurs to go into this crisis? I think the very first thing is just that resilience. I think every entrepreneur I know has had at least 1 or 2 COVID-like moments in their journey. The only difference is just everybody's having it at the same time, but all of us have had a moment where everything fall around us. Like, that big deal you were counting on won't come. You lose this talented employee, that funding just fell through. So having gone through those things, I think has given most entrepreneurs I know above average level of grit that just allow us to push through times like this and keep thinking about moving to B plan, to C plan, and D plan if we have to. The second thing I think we bring to this crisis is so much better understanding of cash flow than your average entrepreneur globally. Someone told me a long time ago that in Africa, the bird in hand is the only bird. There's nothing in the bush. And we have learned that the hard way. So most entrepreneurs I know understand cash flow and are very comfortable replanning around cash, which is, if you're in an entrepreneur business, that's the number one challenge that you're facing right now, is how do you plan for cash? And I think the years of, at least my experience, have shown me that African entrepreneurs tend to understand this so much better and so much quicker than what you will see average around the world.
Thank you, Dari. Ori, you have served as a director of investment at Omidyar. You've been managing director at Luminate, but you're also very widely known for the work you did in founding Ushahidi, a powerful example of African innovation in crisis at a particularly difficult time in Kenya's history during the post-election violence that racked the country. How, flashing forward now, it's 12 years ahead, how do you see this unprecedented crisis of COVID-19 changing the landscape? And in some ways, as an inspiration to all of us, creating new openings and opportunities that entrepreneurs might want to seize?
Thanks, James, and good to be on this webinar. It's actually my first webinar, so it's an interesting format to engage. Yes, I know. So I think a number of differences, as Dario pointed out, I think Ushahidi at that time was a singular experiencing, like Kenya was in crisis and the rest of the world was relatively okay. And so there's an ability to leverage on resources globally, people, time, and bring folks together who are really rallying around this one particular challenge that we were facing. Whereas now everyone is kind of in crisis mode, and sort of the less networked, less of that international kind of cooperation that we saw then, and everyone's just trying to fix their backyards. Although you're seeing, at least on a regional basis, some engagement, and this panel is a good example of that, how we are thinking more regionally and not just what's happening in your country. So that's one difference. But I think some similarities, and for those entrepreneurs who are listening in, is one, a crisis like COVID and the crisis in Kenya then just revealed so many pain points that needed to be resolved that were previously not surfaced. So I think encouraging people, for me, the pain point was information is not flowing. People need to know what's happening. At that time, connectivity was not great. There was no Facebook, there was no WhatsApp, there was no Twitter. And so there was just such a gap in terms of just figuring out, even in the next sort of village or town, what was their situation, your loved ones, if you're in diaspora, what was happening. And I think COVID presents an opportunity, one, to look at what are those pain points that are surfacing right now, and then how can you, if you're an entrepreneur with an idea or thinking about you need to pivot your business because everything has gone to hell, I'd say look at the pain points and not just other people's pain points, your specific one, because you're the person who's then building the solution for that. I think the second kind of opportunity, and the second maybe requirement, and something that we learned from the experience, was just the ability to move fast, because it was a brand new idea. We had mostly no idea what we were doing. Maybe that helped. So this just building, not waiting for perfection, for this perfect business plan. There was no business plan. There's just like, we need to build this tool. Let's build it, and then let's figure out what's next. And so maintaining some speed and agility, and you'll be forgiven at this moment. Everyone will be understanding if things are not quite perfect, but just building and getting things out the door is one lesson I think that we learned then. And that by the time, if we had spent 6 months kind of mapping out, this is the tool, this is the flow, this is how we're gonna raise money, etc., we would never have moved. So crisis sometimes allows for agility. And third, as you've seen from the Ethiopia example, be on the lookout for any policies that are being just implemented in 24 hours, in 1 week. Kenya, we've been pushing for drones to be approved in 7 years. The Loon Balloon, before I left Google, that was like my last project. That was like 7 years ago. It was approved in like within 1 week of the COVID crisis in Kenya. And so thinking about, to the extent that there are regulatory barriers for entrepreneurs that have prevented you from doing certain things, it's wide open for policy. I think a lot of people just focus on the business ideas, but it's a huge opportunity for big policy and regulatory wins at this moment. Is a very rare moment. And so how do you organize as entrepreneurs, as industries, to say, by the way, you remember that thing we've been trying to get you to do for 7 years? If you did it right now, you guys need jobs, you need to stimulate the economy for that to happen. 1, 2, 3. So I see opportunities also around shifting and getting folks to do things that previously they thought were impossible. I think the final point, if I think about back then and what's applicable now, and this Brian raised this point, it's not the hard question, what are you willing to give up at this point? Because I did a farewell email to my colleagues, and I was just walking through my trajectory. And right now it looks like a great success, but there were so many points where it was madness, like we didn't know, payroll nightmares, fundraising, deals falling through. And just so that belief of we're onto something, or I have this idea, is great, and being able to sell the story to other people and maybe your employees if you need to pivot. And that grit that I think it is inherent within African entrepreneurs, but more important now than ever to align that with a story of how do you come out of this? What are you trying to build? I think is so necessary to get you through what will be a tough period, but I think one that presents many, many opportunities, and maybe we can come back to what are some of those opportunities that I see are emerging for African entrepreneurs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ori. I want to now pivot, which seems to be a theme of the day, to some questions that have been coming in. And there's at least a couple of themes that I'm going to synthesize. So I'll pose 2 questions in 2 categories. But as I do that, I will invite, because I think these questions are both for the 4 distinguished panelists here, as well as our 2 fire starters, Maggie and Brian, who I'll invite to re-engage in the conversation, and we'll maybe just go around and get your individual reflections on the 2 questions. The first is about something you've all touched on in various ways, either things you're doing or something that's important to do, which is pivoting in a moment of crisis. And a question around, people hear that. As an entrepreneur, everyone is always telling you pivot, pivot, pivot. How have each of you gone about picking that right moment, or when is it the right moment really to pivot? What are some indicators or ways that or success factors in making a successful translation? Because one person's pivot is another person's lack of focus and panic and jumping around. So, from your own reflection, when has it felt like you were doing it right? And maybe for some of you, when is it that you've maybe lost the plot a little bit? And then the second question is the one that's on the mind of every entrepreneur right now: finance. It's always on our minds, but more so in a moment like this. How do you think about those sources of finance that make at a point like this? Where might people think about, or how might people usefully think about accessing finance in your experience and from what you've been through? So those 2 themes. Without wanting to impose an order, Ori, because you're still warmed up, we'll start with you, and then we'll work our way back around.
Yeah, so I think pivoting, maybe there are a number of things you might want to look at. One, if you have an existing business, is it a case where you need, if you hunker down and cut costs and do all sort of the usual things, will you survive, let's say 12 months from now? Or you accept the reality and you're like, actually, if I'm being quite honest, my business will be dead like in the next 6 months. So there's that just basic. For some, it might make sense to not pivot actually, because you had a good thing going. You just need to kind of hash it through the next few months and you'll be fine. So it's not everyone has to pivot, right? Just because of COVID. There's some businesses that will be fine. Some, as Darius said, are actually doing quite well. If you're in if you're owning a pharmacy chain, or if you're in, food deliveries or whatever, there's some businesses that are doing well. But if you are honest and you say, no matter what I do, no matter how many costs I cut, whatever, that this business will still be dead because, travel, it will take a while for travel to come back. That's a good example. It will take a while. And if you are doing like a lot of startups in Africa today working on curated travel experiences, that might not be back for a while. So I think pivoting. Second, look at your existing team, products, clients, and is there then emerging opportunities that you can do in the short term that might present themselves? For instance, helping SMEs go online. Many of them, this is the first time they're accepting payments. So can you pivot your business into that? Or everyone will have to do some kind of work readiness, social distancing, whatever. If you're an interior designer, can you now open up, can you make yourself a social distancing expert and help people realign their offices and things like that? So, again, looking at the pain points and saying, do you have either the skills or the capabilities to grab onto these new opportunities? Those are the things that I think about. On the finance, it's tough. I don't know what others, particularly for emerging markets, although to the extent, for whatever reason, Africa is not being hit as hard. We're not seeing kind of the scale of the numbers that we're seeing in the US and UK, whether it's in terms of infections and deaths and so on. Money will need to park somewhere. We might have the opportunity to bounce back quicker in terms of opening up, where many other countries will still be in a full lockdown or re-emerging from all sorts of crises. So I think positioning ourselves as as a region, first of all, those of us who are out there and selling, saying there's opportunity here, there's low risk, we have the great entrepreneurs, so attracting that capital that will be locked up will be very, very important. Second, and Aded made a really good point, a lot of, to the extent the World Bank, IFC and so on are putting in money towards our governments to build resilience, ensuring that part of that includes SME finance will be so critical. So again, on the policy level, there's a window to ensure things like SME credits, guarantees are offered. And so looking both not just at private capital, but also putting pressure on governments to cushion SMEs and make sure there's finance available. But that can only be done with very, very active lobbying. But I think that's another opportunity for funding at the moment. Governments offering credit guarantees to local banks and allowing them to then on-lend to SMEs and entrepreneurs.
Dare, anything to add?
Yeah, I think we have, in the existence of MFS Africa, we had to do a pretty hard pivot in 2015, and that was result of a near-death experience. So that's usually a good moment to think about pivoting. And as many companies will experience this kind of stuff in this time, I will not be able to speak for the wide range of entrepreneurs. If you are in a physical business, you're moving trucks or you're running physical supply chain like Ada, I really don't, I'm unqualified to give any piece of advice. But if you are in tech, I think, the good thing about tech is there's always a move. You just have to find it. And it depends how much you want it. Because at the end of the day, our, tech in general relies on recombining, piece of codes and to reorganizing business or environment or a market. So that I can safely say there is always a move that you can make. The thing to think about though is, as I said, how much you want it and how much of your team wants it, because the pivot cannot just be in your head as a CEO, as an entrepreneur. You still need the team, or at least a good chunk of the team, to come with you on this journey. So it is about measuring and understanding that. And there's a good French say that I will try to translate in English. We go something like, if you don't have the means of your policy, you can do the policy of your means. I don't know if there's equivalent in English, but so if you are in tech, you can rethink your business. You can readapt if you still have it in you and your team with you. The other thing I will say though is, if anything, this crisis has made clear to me is the lack of brain power that we're putting as African entrepreneurs in sectors like health, education, agriculture. And I think we have overinvested, quite frankly, on the consumer-facing fintech business. Yes, through M-Pesa, this became the Africa thing. We're all proud of it. But I think we are wasting a little bit of brain power to attack bigger problems on critical segments. And I think this could be an awakening moment. If anything, despite all the chaos, I see a lot of opportunity in health and technology helping in health. I see a lot of opportunity in education, kids sitting at home, how do they learn? I see a lot of opportunities in agriculture, interesting. So I will invite the collective us to pour more brain power into these sectors. Regarding the funding, I think, if you're raising money, if you are in the market to raise money, well, start over. It's obviously, since March, the reality, the world is different. What could be useful is to look for an obvious source of funding. And here are business partners. And again, it depends a little bit on your business, but if you are in a B2B tech business, you're relying on other businesses and you're providing service to other businesses. To the extent that you are providing something critical, they're probably not going to let you die. They might give you a bit of hard time, but they will want to support. And so I will invite entrepreneurs in the tech industry, as I said, to look around those opportunities. There might be, a business partner, a supplier, a client that will be willing to extend, to prepay something, to extend. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do here is to create enough runway so that we can see bit better through the chaos. And, despite obviously that the pool, I think, is going to get smaller, some money will still move, as Ori said. So, of course, you want to make sure that if anybody gets money, it must be you. So that means your story has to be that crisp. You has to be that after it. But I will invite also to look for non-obvious source of funding. You might be able to do on a very innovative type of deals with a critical supply, for instance.
Fantastic. I was going to go to Myriam, but Derek clearly said people should be coming to the space you've been trying to pull African entrepreneurs into, which is agriculture. But your reflections as well. I know that you've been making this point very powerfully over the years that we need more entrepreneurs, more of Africa's best entrepreneurs looking at agriculture and ag value chains. But on to the two questions, pivoting and finance.
Absolutely. I've been thinking about that idea of pivoting, and it's what I speak about with other entrepreneurs who are like dealing with this right now. But as I think about pivoting, I'm thinking about it, you're either pivoting in the same space, so my same business, how do I do things differently to survive through this COVID-19, or pivoting in a completely different area because you're seeing an opportunity of what the world's going to look like going forward. And James, you know me pretty well. We serve on the board of One Acre Fund. And if you remember when we were in Rwanda and when I was trying to start Newly and I was talking about all the other ideas I had, and he said, focus. And that's come up today in our conversation. So I had to think about focusing in my current business, in terms of how I pivot. So all the ideas of businesses that have come to my table that I think are interesting from a tech perspective going forward, I've had to put that on hold and say, how do I use and leverage the digital transformation in my existing business to do things better and to survive? So we're already on the path of, I'm very big on technology leveraging businesses and for entrepreneurs. So we already had our app launched. We had done stuff with a delivery company, a tech delivery company that had a really good seamless system. And we're looking at stuff on the supply chain as well as we track, looking at stuff in precision farming and urban farming. So bottom line, my pivoting and my investments right now and the way I'm looking at things is how do I pivot and make sure I'm involved in businesses that affect my own ecosystem. So thinking about investing in hydroponics, precision farming, urban company that now that people want to have their fresh produce right here in the urban areas, and the fact that there's a lockdown, it's really difficult to bring things from the farms, which is outside most of the urban areas. Thinking about the software as a service type business that is a delivery company that's doing food and stuff. So that's really how I'm focusing on pivoting, and I'll really advise people to kind of put it in those two buckets. Do you pivot, change how you're doing things, or do you completely forget the business you're doing and do something different? On the financing side, that's another area that keeps me up at night. Really want to find right solutions. And I think about this being an opportunity, and I hear what Ori said about the stuff around looking out for those opportunities from a policy standpoint, keeping your radars and the tentacles out there. And Nigeria is a place that crowdfunding was not allowed. Is not allowed from an equity standpoint. It's just completely, the regulators, the SEC doesn't allow it. But right now the SEC is actually putting rules in place to accelerate putting and launching something like this. So we're on it, we're reviewing it, we're sending emails to say, no, don't do this, don't do that. So we have a chance to really be part of that solution. And I think someone mentioned non-financial institutions. The banks are also facing a really tough time. CBN, all the central banks are having tough times as they think about the bigger solution. So I think about folks like the MasterCard Foundation. They have a really good small business resilience program. And I'm trying to get folks to think about that as well. And I think that's awesome. And I think different DFIs, development finance institutions, are looking to do stuff, but we have to think differently. And I wonder if this is the time we start talking about blockchain and stuff like that. Is this the opportunity? But it's, we really have to, that's really how we're looking at financing.
Fantastic. Myriam, all these entrepreneurs pivoting left, right, and center and saying, government, help us access capital, remove some of these barriers. What are your reflections on how you can enable this?
Look, you were asking about whether what we were doing was the right moment or the wrong moment. I think I've never felt as relevant in my professional career as now, being the having led the National Digital Transformation Strategy for Ethiopia. I'm so excited that actually this strategy is going to Council of Ministers today, actually, and it will enable entrepreneurs to strive, and I think this is going to be a paradigm shift for Ethiopia and in driving Ethiopia to a digital economy. So enabling our youth, our entrepreneurs, which represent 70% of our population, by the way, is fundamental for us. It's our bloodline. So, like Ori said earlier, it's a perfect moment to accelerate what has been stagnating: resistance to technology, fear of technology. And again, I'm talking about digital. I'm talking about digital innovations and digital entrepreneurs. It's their moment. Now is their moment. Government has understood the importance of digital. We are a country of 110 million people, scattered across 1.1 million kilometers. There's no other way but going digital in our context. Access to finance, of course, at a macro level, I think Ethiopia and Africa as a whole will need to look into debt restructuring. I mean, the complexity it brought on supply chains, the incredible reduction in remittance inflows, all this will create economic shocks for our countries. So having the support of countries for debt restructuring, and obviously the IMF support that we're getting and that we're hoping to get soon will be of great help. And of that, of course, will be allocated to entrepreneurs to get the economy going. We're in fact looking at a startup act. We're just evaluating whether we need to have a startup act, and maybe not to be bureaucratic and to have changes quickly, is looking at how we can enable sandbox approaches until all these regulations are in place. So yeah, this is from our side.
Interesting and exciting times indeed. Brian, you are observing from China, but I'm sure the very same questions are coming up in your context, and also from the history of Alibaba. There's a lot of experience with these. Maybe your reflections, drawing both from the past and the present, could bring us full circle.
Sure. Thanks, James. Look, I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing in the panelists and what's happening both in the private sector and public sector. Looking at our own fellowship of entrepreneurs, there's been some very creative pivots in responding to the situation. It's mostly out of just pure survival, but what it does is it forces these entrepreneurs to really get creative. And one example in North Africa is a entrepreneur who is running a e-taxi service, and pretty much all the passenger needs and demand dried up. But what he was able to do with his 3,000 person strong database of passengers is actually work with the Department of Health and then help them to administer health tests to these this passenger database. So he completely went from a taxi service to a health testing service in partnership with the government. There's plenty of other examples. One entrepreneur who was running a POS system for 14,000 retailers that were mom and pop shops and restaurants. All the business dried up because there was no foot traffic. So in 72 hours, he built and hacked together a food delivery business. He created the platform, brought on the retail shops and restaurants, and then worked with other eFounder fellows to fulfill these orders, and was able to create a food delivery business and essential good delivery business within 72 hours and make it a viable business. So I think what happens in these times, as Zara mentioned at the beginning of this talk, we had SARS in 2003 impact Alibaba as a company. We had a few hundred people. It would have killed us if we didn't take the right measures to adapt to that change. But what it also did was created momentum in the market. on a smaller basis. I mean, this is a global pandemic we're facing now, but SARS was an epidemic of significant proportions that affected that region. But it accelerated all the development in the private sector. And in addition to that, so I think that's happening in Africa and all around the world. And I think that the strong and creative and as you said, resilient entrepreneurs are going to be the ones that are last man standing. And then those are the ones that are going to be attractive as investments to the venture capital funds that are looking to support and grow future businesses. But I think also what Myriam is saying is very encouraging. Government action, where they're really accelerating the development of policies and opening up these innovative opportunities in spaces in terms of regulatory frameworks to allow the entrepreneurs to accelerate the development is a very, very encouraging thing. Because in China with Alipay, it was the same sort of thing where the government overall was trying to create supportive regulatory environments, but in some cases, supportive meant just giving them space to innovate, make mistakes without overly restricting them too early on in the process. So what I'm seeing from the impact of COVID, it's painful, it's very stressful, a lot of anxiety, but I think that the changes that we're talking about are going to be net very positive for the acceleration of digital transformation in Africa. Okay, you still there, James?
Robin, you're on mute.
Thank you, everyone. Jumping in, I'll pick up here. Brian, thank you very much. And with that, really wanted to extend an echoed thank you to everyone for joining this conversation. When we started off just over an hour ago, we started with this idea that we would have a conversation about the real experiences being felt by entrepreneurs, the critical role that they're playing, begin to explore how is this new normal starting to evolve, and asking for some very practical, pragmatic recommendations and ideas coming from each of you and coming from the conversations we've had. I think we've achieved that in a number of different ways. When I listen to the summary reflections, the reflections on these pointed questions, I hear a lot about, number one, the reality is that this is the time to pivot, and the specificity of what do we mean by pivot. What we mean by pivot is looking to new models for how to build and respond with supply chains, looking for new models for how to explore financing, how to navigate the next evolution of a particular business. I also heard a very specific call to action around critical industries and sectors that are going to influence inclusive growth, a lean in towards agriculture, healthcare, education, and very specifically loud and clear, something about the digital tailwinds that are creating change and ideally creating a positive of change and opportunity for accelerated innovation. And whether that is through the business models that begin to emerge, the way a whole range of businesses are starting to leverage digital in their pivots, or through the acceleration that we see in the policy space. Myriam, you mentioned this, Brian has echoed as well as Ori. In fact, each of you, Dare and Ada, you all referenced the fact that this is the moment where some of the collaborations that Brian has mentioned before between government, between policymakers and entrepreneurs is being accelerated. And we're looking from both sides of the table to ask, what is it that we need in order to take advantage of these digital tailwinds that can begin to unlock both support for entrepreneurs who are at the table today, as well as the entrepreneurs that can continue to build and grow and expand for the continent. So I want to close with the deepest set of gratitude and thanks to each of the panelists and the conversation, in particular, also to the Jack Ma Foundation, Zahra for co-hosting with us. And quickly just let you know about next steps. This is the one of many conversations. As many of you know, we will be continuing these conversations with a focus on West Africa in a few weeks' time. I will echo the message from Brian and Zahra and all of us acknowledging the Africa Business Hero competition, reminding that for the entrepreneurs who are with us today and for those of you who know the businesses that are taking on this challenge and are really transforming the continent, please encourage them to apply. The deadline is June 9th. And then to acknowledge that, again, this is one conversation of many and one that we look forward to continuing. And our intention alongside the Jack Ma Foundation is to pull together these perspectives, recommendations, and insights into a summary report over the coming weeks. So please stay tuned and we'll be sure to keep you posted. But once again, thank you very much. We appreciate your time and look forward to being in touch. Take care.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you, James.